in every situation. And it's even happening in China. In China, with the one-child policy, you have 2 parents and 4 grandparents doting and leaving all of their assets to one child, and those children are ending up with the same idea or the same kind of dependency mindset as people on reserves. And when I was telling you about our meeting with the Minister of Foreign Relations in China, when we were eating dinner, he was asking me about what else I was writing. So I told him about this book. He said, we really need that book in China. And I couldn't imagine why, because they seem to me to be the hardest working people on the planet. And he said because of the one-child policy and the impact that he was worried about. And what he said was that the reason he was worried about it is their generation, who sacrificed everything to lift the population's living standard up in general, did not want to have those milestones lost because of a generation that had no discipline. And he all but said, like the American population. And when you look at the U.S., what made the U.S. strong? Well, during the First World War, they financed their entire war effort through liberty bonds issued through their own people. Second World War, they financed their effort through liberty bonds and taxes. At the end of the Second World War, they were in a position of being able to control the world economy. They could produce 60 to 70% of the world manufacturing output. They controlled everything. And they did up until a very short time ago. So it's really important to try to understand this, because it goes from that level down to the family level or down to the tribal or community level. And I think it's really important. What I learned about the psychological profile of economic dependency is that as Aboriginal people, some of us have this attitude not because we're Aboriginal, which I thought when I was a kid. I thought there was something about this Western economic system that I didn't get. And there was something wrong with me, just like the elder that I was telling you about when I began speaking today. And it's not about being Aboriginal, it's being about put into that situation. And we have to explain this to our kids. And I see this very clearly in East Vancouver, where we run a martial arts club, and we have for 8 years. We see Aboriginal kids, and we see kids from every ethnicity. And the common denominator amongst most of those kids is they're poor. And they all give up easily. A lot of them give up easily because they have learned that over time, if they try to make a difference to their lives, they can't, so they just give up, or they've learned that attitude from their parents. And I think it's important for us to explain to them that they can make a difference to their lives. That there is a possibility of changing the outcome of your life. It doesn't have to be a treadmill to poverty and despair. And when I was researching my first book, I didn't even know what lateral violence was. Does everybody here understand what lateral violence is? I didn't know what it is. As a karate instructor, I thought it is maybe when you punch somebody this way as opposed to this way. But what I learned is it's a phenomenon where if you're part of a group of people, and it could be an ethnic group, the term's been applied to women or to professions, where you feel you're at the bottom of the economic and social heap, and you can't strike out at those above you, so what you do is you start striking out at each other. It's a negative way of saying you have some kind of power, and it's consuming our communities. And it used to be that we supported each other, and we built on that support, and we built our nations on working together. And we need to start thinking about this, and we need to go back to those ideas where we start working together and supporting each other And we start to create an attitude where that kind of environment is the norm rather than lateral violence. What I learned in writing this next book, and I'm writing my next book for the US market, and what I learned is that every society in the world had the attitude that self-reliance was the most important thing. The reason it was important had to do with a variety of things, but the most basic reason is if you weren't able to look after yourself, you'd starve and die. It's pretty straightforward. But there are other reasons. And this is the FDR's State of the Union message when the first form of welfare was introduced. And what he said was, continued dependence on relief induces a spiritual and moral disintegration fundamentally destructive to the national fiber. Now that all makes, when I read this, first time I read it, it made common sense to me, but I didn't understand why. Why is it, and why would our ancestors or our grandparents from whatever culture say that to dole out relief in this way is to administer a narcotic, a destroyer of the human spirit, and so on and so forth? Why does that make sense? And I realized why it made sense to me had to do with what my grandma used to say to me. My grandmother used to say to me when I was a little boy, and my parents were out fishing and she was looking after us, and I was moping around the house. She would say, if you want to feel better about yourself, go outside and do something useful, and then you'll feel better about yourself. When you're a little boy, you think, oh, I guess I'm getting turfed outside by grandma again, which actually happened. And but there's something quite profound in what she was saying. And it has to do with our common sense understanding of things. There's a Quebecois songwriter by the name of Félix Leclerc. In one of his songs, there's a line that says, the best way to kill a man is to pay him for doing nothing. Now that made sense to me too. What I didn't know is, why does that make sense? And in my next book, I had a chance to think and research this, and I think I figured out in general why welfare doesn't work. But it's not something I figured out, it's something that our grandparents and ancestors had figured out all along. The most valuable thing to us as human beings, the most valuable thing to us as social animals, is the need to feel needed by our family and our close friends and our tribes. The most important thing to us is to feel needed. And when you give somebody a welfare check, you're giving them the material sustenance they need to survive, but because they're not doing anything for it, it doesn't validate their sense of self-worth.